Greetings! Today we are going to be having a discussion about the ego. The ego. Now it's a special request that we talk about the ego because I talk about the ego a lot and I always just assume people know what I mean, and obviously that's not true because I've seen some discussions about the ego going on the forums and things like that. So I want to just be clear about what I mean when I'm talking about the ego. Okay, now the ego is a very old concept, and if you want to know about the birth of the ego, you can study Poimandres by it's the Vision of Hermes. It's one of the Hermetic philosophy books that's been saved from the fire at Alexandria library. So any of the Hermetic books are wonderful for studying. But if you want to understand the ego, Poimandres is a great one. It speaks a lot in allegory, but also the book of Genesis is a good one for understanding the birth of the ego. The Lord in the book of Genesis is not God Almighty from the point of view of the Gnostics. From a Gnostic point of view, the Lord in the book of Genesis is the ego, or what they don't call it the ego. In the Gnostic philosophy, they called that the demiurge. The demiurge. But let's just talk about the ego as practically and non-superstitiously and non-symbolically as possible. But before we do that, we have to just kind of cover what some basic metaphysical theory is that at least for the sake of this discussion, we'll assume to be true just for sake of discussion, and then you can go back to thinking anything you want after that. So the idea of the difference between cause and effect. We say that all cause comes from the mind, and all effect is a result of the mind. So anything in the manifest world is a reflection of an invisible concept, or there is nothing in manifest reality that doesn't have its invisible counterpart in the world of cause. So in Hermetic principle, it's said as above so below, or as within so without. That doesn't mean that everything is equal. Heaven and earth are not equal. That it means that as above, so below, meaning there's nothing so below that didn't come from as above. He also says as within, so without. That means that it comes from within to the without. That's the flow of creation. That's the flow of manifestation, is from the in to the out, from the up to the down. So that means from the invisible to the visible. Never does it say, but sometimes it's from out to in, and sometimes it's from down to up. It does. He never says that. The Hermetic principles never state that. And that's because there's one truth as far as how manifestation flows. It flows from the mind to manifestation. It flows from the invisible into the visible. All right. So anything that we experience is a result of a thought. Anything we experience is a result of a thought. All thoughts create form on some level or another. On some level or another, all thoughts create form. Maybe not form that is always as tangible in your life for you to see, but there is no such thing as a thought that doesn't have creative ability, that doesn't have a creative function to it. Now, we have to think very abstractly when we're talking about the ego, especially how we came up with this whole idea of the ego. The ego is the idea of an identity that is separate and distinct from everything else. So the ego is a construct within the mind that is based on the idea of separateness, the idea of being separate and distinct from all creation. So the ego is not an entity. it's a construct. It's a thought construct. It's like a computer program that is programmed to see things separately, to see things based on what they're not rather than what they are. So the ego will look at your world and say, well, that picture is the picture because it's not everything else. The ego will look at your relationships and say, oh, this person is important to me, therefore they're the one. They're special. Your ego will look at your money and just say, I have money that nobody else has, and there's a finite amount of money, therefore I have to go get more money before everybody else gets my money. That's how the ego looks at money, because it looks at everything as separate, as finite, as mortal. We would say that the ego is the mortal part of your mind. It's the idea of your mind that believes in mortality. It's the part of your mind that believes everything must have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and therefore it is the part of your mind that is subject to time and is subject to death. The mind is not subject to death. The mind is immortal. The mind is eternal, and we were created as a thought in the mind of our Creator, infinite intelligence, and we would say that our identities or our souls are as a sunbeam is to the sun, and that we are extensions of that infinite light, that infinite life, that principle of life, and that's what a lot of people call God or goddess. And we say God and goddess are one, just like the positive and negative poles of a battery are one, or of a magnet are one. So we do see a God and a goddess. We do see a trinity of sorts, meaning that there's a God and a goddess and a holy child, and that's what we are. We are part of a holy family in that regard. So, but the God and goddess do not express themselves as being separate from one another or separate from their creations. God does not create through separation. God creates through extension. God creates through giving of itself. And if we want to create like God creates, then we create through giving. So when we see lack in the world, in order to create like God, we have to bless that world, and then that world will bless us. Because that's the nature of reality, that your manifest world will reflect back to you that which you think of it, that which you believe. And so if you believe that the world is where your good lies, then you're going to be afraid, because you have to look into the world for your good and find some good. And if you're looking into the world of separation for good, by definition, you're looking into the place where there's lack, where there's finite resources, where there's limits. But if you look to the world of spirit, where there is unlimited resources, and you use spirit to bless your world, then you will have your world bless you back, because it's just following instructions. The world is not causative. It's responsive. So it responds to cause. It's a world of effect. So now the ego, being being an idea of separateness, it values everything that is that it can own. It values everything that it can have separate and distinct from everybody else. It values that which that is not to be shared. It values that which is which it considers to be unique. So what the ego considers to be unique and what your soul considers to be unique are very different. Now your soul is extremely unique. Your soul is like a thumbprint. Your soul is individual. And individual literally means undivided. Now the ego doesn't even understand a concept that individual means undivided. That just doesn't even make sense to the ego. The ego sees everything as being mine and yours, good and bad, light and dark. And mostly it sees it as separate. This is this because it's not everything else. That's how it thinks. So Now, there's nothing wrong with your ego. It's not that the ego's evil. It's not that the ego is bad. It's just that it's nothing. The ego's not bad. It's not the new Satan. It's not something that should be cursed into existence, out of existence. It's just that we have to understand it for what it is. The ego is the part of us that is the epitome of arrogance. Now, let's just consider this. How, in order to create an ego for ourselves, meaning to separate out, there's this idea that God, when God created you, the ego would see that as being that something that needed to be improved on. And how do you improve on perfection? How do you separate off infinite good from the rest of creation? How do you make something distinct? How do you distinguish something that's infinitely good, that's infinitely light? Well, the only way to do that is by finding a way that it's not good enough. The only way to do that is to find a way for it to be bad, that there's something bad. That's the only way that you can distinguish yourself from infinite good. So since the ego sees everything being separate and is defined by what it's not, in order for it to separate itself from infinite good, it can't do that until it creates a lie that you're somehow not good enough, that you're somehow bad, that somehow you are missing something. And that's the only way. Those are the only tools it has at its disposal to separate you out, because there's no other way to be superior to infinite good than to be bad, right? So that's why the ego is constantly trying to remind you of either how bad you are, or how bad everybody else is. There's always one of the ego's main activities in day-to-day life is looking at how something doesn't measure up, or how something is not good enough. I can guarantee you that's its opinion of you to begin with, is that you're not good enough, because that's how it keeps you separate. It's the only way to keep you separate. But then in order to keep those illusions in place, it has to also find fault in everything else that it sees, because that's the only way that it has. It's the only power it has to keep you in its false world. Because the world that we see is not the world that was created for us. The world we see is a world that's being reflected back to us, thoughts that are not real. Thought, meaning when I say thoughts that are not real, that means that those are thoughts that were not created by us. Those are thoughts that were not created by our souls. Those are not thoughts that created as God creates. Those are thoughts that are the ego's attempt at creation, which it can't do. The ego can't create, because it's just a bit of darkness in our minds. It's just a bit of darkness in our minds. It's a little bit of insanity. And a little insanity goes a long way. Think of that. Think of the insanity of the ego. What's the point in creating a world and an identity that is separate and distinct from the way we were created? What good can come of holding a mind hostage from its true heritage? What good can come of that? Just because of its own need to have arrogance, its own need to be arrogant. That's all. And so we allow ourselves to be held hostage by this little construct in our mind that's nothing but a computer program. You know, people are like, well, why does the ego constantly want to destroy us? Doesn't it realize that if we're destroyed, that it dies? Well, that would make sense logically, but the ego's insane. The ego's insane. How could it be anything but insane if it's trying to separate off from good? What good can come from that, right? So it's not that the ego's bad. It thinks it's bad, but it's not that the ego's bad and that we need to hate it. It's just that we need to understand when we are experiencing things from the ego's eyes, it's never going to get resolved until we change our mode of thinking. You can't expect healing to occur in your world from the point of view of the diseased thinking that created it in the first place. And that's what the ego is. It's just a sickness in the mind of humanity. And everybody's got it. And the biggest tragedy is that it's not real and it doesn't need to be. And we can choose differently. And when we do that, and we catch glimpses of the world that God created versus the world that the ego is trying to make us believe is happening, when we catch glimpses of it, it's almost like a miracle happens. When we catch those glimpses, that's when things just change before our eyes, and we see, wait a minute, I can have a whole new way of living. I can have a whole new world to live in than the one that I think I'm living in, just by changing the glasses that I'm wearing. Am I listening to, it's like you have two voices in your mind. One, the one that you were born with, the one that you were created with, and that's the voice for God, if you will. That's the voice that is constantly reminding you of your magnificence and who you are. And then you've got the voice of the ego that's constantly trying to distract you from that, so that you can invest your life force in it. Think of the ego almost as like a little parasite, as like a little parasite that it's got its own weird little survival instinct, even though it's completely insane and it realizes that, it can't realize. I mean, if it just sat, if the ego had any self-awareness and it sat and realized that it doesn't exist, it would be very terrified. It would be very, very terrified of itself. So it just goes on and on and on, trying to distract. So it doesn't ever have to face the fact that it doesn't exist, that it's not real. This is all just a nightmare. All of it is. The whole thing is a horrible nightmare that we've been caught up in, wasting all this life thinking about me versus them, mine versus yours, them versus us, not even understanding that the way that the ego uses the body is completely different than the way that your soul wants to use your body. The ego uses your body and it gets sick. The ego uses your body and it attacks each other, either by fighting with hands or weapons, or by with words, or even with ideas, with thoughts. Think about how many attack thoughts you have day in and day out, and the ego is very sly and cunning, because the ego may be insane, but it's not stupid. In fact, it's your own genius used against you. Think about how many times during the day that you have an opinion about somebody or something that doesn't need to be there, but it's a bad one. You think about, it's just like, you know something about them, or you're like, even just driving, like, oh, that evil bitch, look at how she just almost cut me off. When you're in a party, with a party, and somebody comes up that's not there. Oh, did you hear? Blah, 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 blah. Why do we do that? Well, because the ego wants to keep us busy. The ego wants to keep us busy thinking and talking about stuff that has nothing to do with who we are, has nothing to do with why we're here, and it has nothing to do with our unique spiritual goodness that is the truth of our being. Now, when the ego does finally get shined away, it's similar to the water being thrown on the wicked witch. I mean, it's just gone, and we didn't even need to be going through the whole thing. That's the tragedy of it all. We don't even need to be going through a lot of this stuff. So what we can do is not so much like, how do I rise above the ego? How do I kill the ego? All that stuff. You don't have to do any of that. All you have to do is be aware of it and make a new choice. And that's why each of us have a connection to what we call a teacher, an internal teacher, a mental teacher, a spirit guide. What that is, it's called a still small voice within you. And that still small voice is the voice of you. It's the voice of your soul. It's the voice of your truth. And it's always there. It's always available. And it's always constantly capable of having all power over any circumstance that the ego is trying to convince you is unsolvable. That's the ego's main tool to keep you stuck and busy and not getting back to your soul. That's the main way that it keeps you stuck, is by keeping you busy with seemingly unsolvable problems. There's a plethora of them for you. And it's constantly got another unsolvable problem that it will keep putting up in front of you so that you're busy. Because it wants you to do anything but ask your soul for help, or ask your teacher for help. Because when you ask your teacher for help, when you ask your internal teacher for help, and you can call it whatever you want. It can be called a spirit guide, it can be called the goddess, it can be called your higher self, it can be called your higher power, it can be called God, whatever you want to call that part of you that's connected to the truth. It doesn't want you hanging out there, because it knows that if you find out the truth, that it will die. Now, it doesn't know why, because it's not privy to that, because it can't even conceive of unity, because it's the idea, it's a thought form of separation. So you can never talk to it, you can never reason with the ego, because the ego can't even conceive of a world where there is no separation. It can't even conceive of the idea of you having unity with brothers and sisters in spirit. You can't understand that. Everything is a conflict for the ego. Everything is a separate, isolated universe. Everything to the ego has to be lone and lonely and depressing. Even things like sex and joy and happiness and parties and things like that, when the ego gets a hold of them, it'll give you a little bit of something that you might consider joy, but only enough so that you don't get too upset, so that you look for help, right? It'll give you a little bit of that, but even with those things, even the little so-called rewards that the ego gives you, they're things that are there for you to chase the dragon on. They're not eternal pleasures. The spirit will show you eternal pleasures that never die, that are available to you at all times, always have been, always will be. Right? But the ego's pleasures are things that are addictive in nature, and that are subject to death, because everything that the ego does is subject to death, because it doesn't know anything eternal. So all of the pleasures that the ego will give to you for your consideration have an expiration date, and then you're going to have to chase the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and that's how it keeps you so busy, so that you never sit and contemplate the reality that maybe I don't even need to work like this. Maybe I don't even need to live in a world like this. Maybe there's another way. Maybe there's an alternative way. Maybe this isn't the way I was meant to be. You start thinking like that, and then you ask for help, and then the universe is there to help you, right? Because nobody comes in uninvited. If your spirit guide came in just uninvited, just like, oh yeah, no, we got to get rid of your ego. We're gonna fix this for you. That's an attack. That's a type of attack. I mean, it's an invasion, right? And that's not how infinite love works. Now we say, well, why would we do this? Why would we even consider that? Well, because of an insane little idea that we contemplated. What would it be like to be separate from God? What would it be like to have my own universe? What would it be like if I were bigger than God, right? It's just an insane little idea that we were sitting and contemplating at some point in our creation. But what is reality is that we are free to think anything we want to think, and that our thoughts are always going to be powerful and creative, because we were created by God. So we are gods ourselves. So our thoughts are very, very powerful. So if we sit and contemplate the idea of separation, then separation will arise for us, because that is the way of the world. And then we have to obey the entire insane rule book of the ego in order to stay within that kingdom, the kingdom of the ego, which is the world that we live in. But the thing is that, like I said, it's not real. None of this needs to be. And just asking to be released from it, just asking to be shown the truth, is all that it takes to start to shine away these problems that are presented by the ego. And then to help other people shine away the problems that are put in there by their egos, simply we do that simply by demonstrating. Every time we reunify with our spirit and we forego attack, every time that we forgive rather than embrace our resentments, we are demonstrating to the group mind that spirit is real and the ego is false. And light overcomes darkness by nature. So just a tiny little bit of light in a dark mind fills up that mind with darkness. So it doesn't take a lot of people thinking these thoughts for it to have an effect on the group mind of the species. It just takes enough. It just takes enough people thinking thoughts of light. So, again, the ego is nothing to be afraid of. It's nothing more than a construct, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have power. In this world, it has a lot of power because this is its domain. This is its domain. This is a world of separation that we live in. So you don't want to underestimate the power of the ego. You don't want to underestimate the intelligence of the ego. That's why you don't want to start to battle with the ego, because the ego will always win, because you're trying to battle with an ingenious part of your mind that's already an expert at battle, that's already an expert at conflict. It's already an expert at attack. So that's not the way to escape from the ego. The way to escape from the ego is the way you escape from any darkness, by realizing that it's not real and by shining light into it. And that's why you have your mental teacher, because it's always there for you. Now, like I said, you have two voices, and you can choose to listen to either one. But the voice of the ego is very loud, and it's always the first thing to tell you where to go, because it doesn't want you to have any silence in your mind, because then you might start listening to truth. So it keeps you really busy. It keeps your mind really busy. It keeps you focused and scattered on things that don't ultimately matter. It wastes your day so that you don't sit and contemplate. But once you start a meditational practice or a magical practice or a spiritual practice, something like that, then little by little you start to train yourself to not automatically listen to that quick, loud voice, that you start to learn how to just give it a couple beats, and you learn how to ask. You learn how to ask the peaceful voice within you, the true voice within you, where it would have you be going, and what it would have you be doing, and how it would have you respond to a situation, rather than the reactive types of responses that the ego is constantly encouraging you to indulge in. And you know that that's true if you just look at your life. It's not that foreign of a concept once you start looking at your life. Yeah, there's a lot of choices that I've made in my life, and very few of them have been because I was listening to the voice for peace. Most of them have been a reaction based on the urgings of my ego, that clamoring voice is telling you, do it, right? And then you get in trouble. So it's important to understand that this part of the mind does not have your best interest at heart. It is destructive. Anybody that thinks that they don't have self-destructive tendencies, anybody that thinks that they don't have parts of their mind that are at odds with itself, parts of their mind that are out for its own destruction, if you don't believe that that's true, you don't need to. All you have to do is observe your life, and you'll know it's true. You'll know it's true. You know, it's a blow to the ego to recognize that that we're damaged individuals here in this world, but the spirit is very quick to remind us that in this realm we might look a little damaged, but the truth is that none of this damage is real. Therefore, you don't have to worry about it because you're safe. You're safe. You're just as safe as you've always been. This is the voice for your soul is always reminding us you're just as safe as you've always been. You're just as eternal as you've always been. You're just as powerful as you've always been, and you're just as happy as you've always been. It's just that you're focusing in a world, you're dallying in a world and with an ego because you think that those things are valuable. You think that sex is valuable for its own sake. You think that money's valuable for its own sake. You think that that possessions are valuable for their own sake. You think food's valuable for its own sake. All of these things in the world that tempt us, they're not bad. You can have them, you can enjoy them, but from the ego's point of view, that is where your good is. And so that's why it has us on these treadmills of addiction and sensory addictions and bodily addictions and things like that, and even mental and emotional addictions. All of those things, those emotional chemicals and things like that are in our lives, those are addictive as well. Where a lot of people get addicted to chaos. A lot of people get addicted to misery. A lot of people get addicted to all kinds of things like that. So just because you don't like the idea that there's a part of your mind that's kind of out to get you doesn't mean that it's not there. And you know it's there by just looking at your life, right? And the good news is that it has ultimately no power over you, and that even with the ego, nothing can happen without your decision. Nothing. The ego cannot make a decision for you. It can't. The ego can't force you to do anything because it's just thoughts in your mind. It's just thought programs. It's a program of separation. It's there to do a job as it sees it. Nothing personal. But it's insane, and no good will come of it. It really does want your destruction. And again, that's not to make you paranoid. It's actually to release you from paranoia. Because the reason why you're so paranoid is because you're listening to the part of your mind that you should be aware that wants you destroyed. But once you start to work on yourself, once you start to listen to truth, once you start to do these kinds of disciplines, and it doesn't matter which path you choose. It doesn't have to be my way. It can be any way that's legitimate. That is going to train you to put your mind focused on the truth rather than illusion, focusing on that voice for peace rather than that voice for pain. And that's it. And that's the only way that you can so-called overcome the ego. You don't even need to overcome it. It'll be done for you if you ask. If you ask. And then what our job has to be is trying to do our best to stay present in each and every moment. And when we are faced with a decision, to not make the decision all by ourselves anymore, because we're never really making the decision by ourselves. We're making the decision usually based on some kind of hunger or desire, or based on some sort of wisdom from our higher self. We're either making a decision based on the ego, something to protect ourselves or to get what we want, or usually to defend ourselves. Or we're listening to the voice of the spirit, which is the voice that will give you a choice on how to transform the situation, how to reconnect with those people, how to make everything in that situation a win for everybody, how to make sure that prosperity is never ending rather than just a one-time deal. Those kinds of things. It's not that the spirit wants to take away all your fun and all away your goodies. It just wants to take away all your addictions to those things. It wants to take away all the ways in which those things hurt you and keep you stuck and keep you in a misery all the time. All right? So don't be afraid of the ego, and it's nothing that you have to feel like you have to overcome. It'll be done for you if you keep your mind focused on the right voice, and you ask. That's why we practice. That's the only reason why we practice, why we have to have a practice. None of this will happen all by itself. We have to have some sort of practice where we can stay centered in our spiritual truth and allow that spiritual truth to inform our day-to-day activities one moment at a time, rather than allowing ourselves to go unconscious and make choices based on ego thoughts. And remember that those ego thoughts are destructive by nature because of why they were made. That ego was made in order to separate you and keep you separate from your good. And so until we get to a point where we can let go of that program altogether, we don't have to be, we don't have to listen to it. We don't have to be victimized by it. Once we realize it's just a choice, that it has no power over us. It has no power over us whatsoever. It's just a choice that we make, and we get lazy with our choices. That's all. And so once we decide we're not going to be lazy with our choices, that we're going to commit to a practice, we're going to commit to really immersing ourselves to knowing who we are at our spiritual core, then we are more inclined, when those times come where we have to make choices, to listen rather than to react. And that's it. So I don't know if that helped clarify things a little bit, but the ego is definitely nothing to be afraid of, and it's nothing monolithic. It's nothing outside of you. It's just a program within your own mind that is a program of separation, and as a result, it's a very destructive program. And it's because of that program, the way we view the world creates a world that is not a pleasant world to be in. But it doesn't need to be that way. And we can learn to overcome and transform that. And we'll see that as we do that, our world starts to reflect the truth of who we are. And that's a really beautiful thing. And that's ultimately where we want to be. We might call that even heaven on earth. That when we can get to a point where our lives start to reflect that. And so that's what that biblical injunction that the meek shall inherit the earth, that's what that means, because eventually the earth comes back to reflecting the truth of who we are. And the truth of who we are, the meekness that the Bible is talking about, or the Psalms are talking about, the meekness simply means well-trained and non-reactive. So that's the reason to train our minds, is so that we are no longer being run by rote by this ego mind, which is actually not connected to our spirit at all. It's a false sense of who we are, and it's a false attempt at trying to be a separate self rather than a unified self. All right, thank you very much for being with me today, and I hope that helped to clear up some things. Until next time, blessed be.